on Northwest Politics, doubling down on climate. Oregon's treasurer increases climate-related investments within the state's retirement fund, even as the Trump administration pulls out of the Green Climate Fund and abandons support for renewable energy. State Treasurer Elizabeth Steiner sits down with me to talk about why Oregon is going all in on green. And as Portland and Multnomah County try to overcome major challenges, what can we learn by crossing the county line? I sit down with Beaverton Mayor Lacey Beatty to find out why that Washington County city is thriving even as Portland struggles. Eye on Northwest Politics starts now. Thanks for joining us. This is Eye on Northwest Politics. I'm Ken Boddy. Let's get right to your top political headlines. Jamie Dunphy is Portland's new city council president. The change in leadership comes a full week after multiple rounds of voting produced a deadlock between Alana Pertogini and Samir Canal. Dunphy took the role as a compromise, but says he does not do it happily. The council president presides over the council agenda and sets the tone for what will happen with this new government in 2026. Governor Tina Kotek has tapped Bend Republican Tim Knope to become her new Chief Prosperity Officer. According to an announcement sent Wednesday, Knope is charged with spearheading the work in Kotek's office to increase the state's gross domestic product, among other duties. Knope's time in the Senate ended when he was banned from running for another term after leading a 6-week Republican walkout in the 2023 legislative session. Knope starts his new role this coming week. And Oregon Democrats unveil the bills they're working on ahead of the 2026 short legislative session. The bills would boost sanctuary laws and give schools authority to warn about federal agents on school grounds. They're also working on a bill to protect Oregon's public lands from development by the federal government. The 35-day session begins on February 2nd. Oregon State Treasurer Elizabeth Steiner just released a progress report on climate-related investments within the state's public employees retirement fund. It's called Tracking Net Zero and Climate Positive Investment Strategies. Among the key accomplishments, a more than 50% year-over-year reduction in portfolio emissions intensity, we'll talk about what that means, and a doubling of climate-positive real asset investments to $2.4 billion, delivering a 20% rate of return over the past 5 years. So why the emphasis on climate-related investments when the Trump administration is going the opposite direction and especially not supportive of renewable energy? Oregon State Treasurer Elizabeth Steiner is here to talk about it. A physician by trade, Treasurer Steiner served in the state Senate for 13 years before being elected treasurer in 2024. She is the first woman elected state treasurer in the state of Oregon. Treasurer Steiner, welcome back to Eye on Northwest Politics.
Pleasure to be here again, Ken.
Well, according to your office, the Public Employee Retirement Fund has a little more than $100 billion in assets. It is one of the top retirement funds, pension funds in the nation. So why the emphasis on climate-related investments?
You know, Ken, you mentioned that we had achieved this 50% reduction in emissions intensity. And while we will certainly take credit for some of that in terms of the investments that we made, a lot of that relates to market trends. When we were passing the Climate Resilience Investment Act in 2025, we pointed out to legislators as they were considering it that the market trends are moving toward renewable energy, toward battery storage, toward climate positive investing. And we are moving with the market, which is what our investment team always looks to do.
How do these investments perform relative to the other investments you oversee?
Well, you yourself mentioned that in, for example, our real assets portfolio, that's things like wind turbines and solar farms and factories and things like that. Our climate positive investments returned 20% over the past several years, which is a very respectable rate of return and significantly better than our carbon intensive investments in that portfolio. So the two things are very compatible. Climate positive investing and growing the OPERF, the Oregon Public Employee Retirement Fund, are absolutely compatible with each other.
Also mentioned that one of your stated accomplishments, a 50% year-over-year reduction in portfolio emissions intensity. What is portfolio emissions intensity?
That's a great question. Portfolio emissions intensity happens when, in this case, S&P Global, which is the outside firm that audited all of our investments and tried to figure out what the emissions were, they look at a company that we're invested in, they figure out what its emissions are, and then they attribute part of those emissions depending on how much of the company we own, right? I'm going to be brief, but imagine there are 100 shares for a company and we own 5 of them. We are accountable for 5% of the emissions that that company does in 3 different arenas: Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. We can get into that if you want, but that's fundamentally what we do.
We often mention wildfires and drought when we're talking about the impacts of climate change. Mm-hmm. How does this investment strategy fit into that, specifically for the state of Oregon? That's
such an important point that you raise. As we look at investing, not only do we consider emissions, we also look at the likely impact of climate change on the business itself. For example, if we're looking at a company and many of its factories, if it's a manufacturing company, and many of its factories are in areas that are prone to extreme weather, that's a risk. And our investment team has to take risk into consideration. So we think about those things as we're considering where to invest.
Well, the Trump administration is openly against renewable energy, not too concerned about greenhouse gas emissions. And we just learned this week that the EPA will now only consider the cost to industry when setting pollution limits, not the impact to human health. That is a major shift in national policy. So what's your take on that?
Well, I'm really disappointed by that proposed change in the EPA. And what concerns me is that it's a little short-sighted and it's somewhat disingenuous, which is to say that if we don't consider the impact to human health, human health affects business, right? If people aren't healthy, they're not as productive at work, or they don't show up as well, or health insurance costs go up, which affects business costs. So it's a little short-sighted to say we're not going to consider the impact of emissions or EPA or climate-related changes, environmental changes on human health, because all of those things impact business, they impact our economy. Unhealthy kids don't learn well. Those kinds of things are so important. So I'm hoping the EPA reconsiders that proposal.
You know, critics say this is a woke investment strategy. How do you respond to that?
You know, I think it's not a woke. We've demonstrated that we're doing really well. Our portfolio is doing really well by thinking about climate positive investing. And I would argue, just as I mentioned earlier, that things like climate and human health and governance structures absolutely are material factors. They are pecuniary. They relate to the impact, the money impact of that investment. And I would argue that just like I tried to practice evidence-based medicine as a physician, we are trying to practice evidence-based investing. We do our due diligence, and we need to understand all the factors that could affect a company's bottom line.
Let's talk about PERS in general. Where are we in terms of the public employee retirement system and our ability to sustain it over the long term?
Well, I've got some great news on that front. For the past 10 years, the Oregon Public Retirement Fund has grown at a rate that's higher than what's called the assumed rate that the PERS board sets. The PERS board every year sets what their expectation for what we're going to get in terms of investments over the next year. And that's how they determine what's called the unfunded actuarial liability, how short we are in the pension fund. And in turn, that's what affects how much public employers have to put in to help make up for it. The good news is we are doing way better, generally speaking. For example, in 2025, the PERS assumed rate was 6.9% return. We achieved 8.7%.
So our retirees, state retirees, should be in pretty good shape.
Our retirees are in very good shape, and we're hoping that those good returns reduce the unfunded liability, and that in turn will at least hold employer rates flatter, which will mean better ability to hire people to provide the services that public employers provide to our people across our state.
Only got about a minute left, but I do want to get to this. You put out a statement after the shootings by federal agents in Southeast Portland, saying in part that Homeland Security must suspend its reckless and dangerous operations in Portland. You're the state treasurer. Why did you feel the need to put out a statement on that?
That's a great question. You know, as state treasurer, I care a lot about our state's economy, and as a physician, I care a lot about human health, right, and the health of our communities. If people are afraid to go out, if people are afraid to go to work, if people who are in our country for whatever reasons, as long as they are law-abiding while they're here, they should not be afraid to go out and earn a living to support their families, to show up for work, to take their kids to school. All of these things impact our economy. And as treasurer, that matters to me a lot.
State Treasurer Elizabeth Steiner, thank you for being here on Eye on Northwest Politics.
Always a pleasure to talk with you, Ken.
Next, while Portland and Multnomah County are struggling to deal with its problems, the Portland suburb of Beaverton is apparently thriving. So what's happening in Beaverton, and why is it becoming a viable choice over its big city neighbor? My conversation with Beaverton Mayor Lacey Beatty, next.